Hello, students. Here we go again. We're now on week 31 of American history. We're looking at the 1950s. So let's check out what happened here. So we know that Eisenhower had been the hero of D-Day, right? He had orchestrated the whole invasion over there on France and all that business and became a big hero. And he was easily elected in his first, when he first ran, to become the president. Right, so here he is as the president. We have sort of an idyllic time, or at least perceived that way. He's president number 34. So the Eisenhower years. All right, so the good news, let's look at that first. First of all, we have, oh yeah, I've got them right here, y'all. Cheetos. I'm going to have one. Okay, those are yummy. Also, look what came out. Junior Mints. I think that's probably my favorite candy right there. I'm going to pause here for just a second. All right, I just had to finish chewing on my Cheetos. They were delicious. I actually haven't had Cheetos in a while, so that was very good. So those came out in the 1950s, kind of the new things, and I would have certainly brought some of these for you if we were in class. So we think of the 50s as sort of idyllic. You know, we have the men have come home from the war, and they just want to have a family. And, you know, all the good American values that are there. Okay, so we have images like this that come out. Some of the TV shows were you know, promulgating this idea, possibly a myth, if you want to call it that way. We had a baby boom at this time. So you've probably heard of the boomers, right? The baby boomers. Lots of babies were born right after the war. The statistics show here that from the time of the end of the war, so 1946 up to 64, these are the baby boomers. So anybody who was born in these years, I'm included in there. They're called boomers, right? So there's the whole okay boomer thing. That's who you're talking to, people who were born in those years. And that's because lots and lots of babies were born. So therefore our population increased quite a bit. So that's the baby boomer generation. So that's taking place during this time. But there was also bad news on the horizon. Remember we talked about duck and cover last time and how people were afraid, the Red Scare, you know, afraid that communists were around the corner, that they were making communist movies and all that kind of thing. Well, the nuclear arms race really heated up in the 1950s. Remember, Eisenhower was a general. He knew all about what was going on in military. And so he knew that having enough armament would be important to fight against the evil empire, if you will, of the communists. Now, the communists, of course, had got a hold of the technology to build a bomb because of spies. So the whole spy thing is going to continue on through the 50s. We have spies, they have spies. Espionage is all over the place. We'll look at a specific case here in a little bit. But we're looking at a nuclear arms race because the atomic bomb was, invented. But now they're looking at even more dangerous things, you know, the hydrogen bomb and things like that. So people continued to have their bomb shelters. Some of them built them underground. This looks like a silo type thing that has been maybe buried underground, and they have everything ready. Notice they have a radio to hear what's going on. They have their food and this kind of thing, and a place to sleep. So some of these could have been elaborate. Most of them were pretty simple, and the vast majority of them were never obviously used because we didn't have a big war from that. There were also race problems happening in the 1950s. We'll see the 60s will kind of culminate in a big racial divide that is to be fixed by legislation from Washington. But we're looking at here some of these. We have some marchers here, people who are demanding their equal rights and things like this. We'll look at several cases that were very important. One of them was in Montgomery, Alabama. There was a very famous bus boycott. Now, you might be wondering, why is there a bus boycott? Well, a lot of the people in the city used the buses to get to work and things like this. A lot of the African American population used buses, and there were rules about where they could sit on the bus. We're going to see a little video here in just a minute. And so because these rules were this way, if somebody was seated on a bus and a white person got on, the bus driver might ask the African American person, the black person, to get up and move. And so we had an incident that took place at this time where a young girl, she was like 15 years old. Her name is, I'm looking it up, Claudette Colvin, here she is. She got on the bus and she was sitting in a seat, and then a man or somebody, a white person, got on. She was asked to move and she refused to move. And so when she refused to move, she thought, why in the world do I need to move? Well, she was arrested. She's only 15. And then, of course, we know then the story is going to come up for the person who actually made the stand for the court case, and that is Rosa Parks. All right, so Rosa Parks purposefully stayed in her seat so that she could bring the case up before the court. So let's watch a little video on that. I'll eat some more Cheetos.
Most of us know the inspiring story of Rosa Parks, the African-American civil rights activist who refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The bus boycott spurred by Parks' arrest would help bring down the racist laws of the Jim Crow South and turn a young preacher named Martin Luther King Jr. into the country's best-known civil rights leader. But we bet you didn't know that the story behind the bus boycott isn't quite as simple as it might seem. To start with, Rosa Parks wasn't the first black woman to resist bus segregation in Montgomery. In fact, several different women had been arrested for the same offense in the last 12 months. One of them was 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. On March 2nd, 1955, she was riding the bus home from high school when the driver demanded she give up her seat for a white woman. After Colvin refused, police officers arrived on the scene and dragged her off the bus in handcuffs. Claudette Colvin would go on to become one of 4 black female plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, the Supreme Court case that would effectively end bus segregation. As a longtime volunteer in the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and secretary to its president, Rosa Parks advised and supported Colvin. She knew that local black leaders had been thinking about how to confront bus segregation in Montgomery for years before 1955. She also knew they were looking for a test case, an upstanding citizen they could rally the community around. But Parks certainly didn't plan on becoming that test case herself until December 1st, 1955. At the wheel of the Cleveland Avenue bus that day was James Blake, the very same driver who had ordered Parks off his bus after a confrontation 12 years earlier. Parks was sitting in the middle section of the bus when Blake told her and 3 other black riders to stand up so that one white man could sit. The 3 other black riders moved, but she refused. Some people have said Parks was simply too exhausted from working a long day to move to the back of the bus, but she said later she wasn't physically tired, just tired of giving in to Jim Crow. The real story behind the Montgomery bus boycott may not be as simple as the myth, but it is no less powerful. The courageous resistance of Rosa Parks, Claudette Colvin, and other ordinary women became the life force of the civil rights movement.
All right, there we go. So there she is, sitting on the bus. That was probably a post picture that was taken later. But it did bring about some legislation that was very important for the civil rights movement. We'll get some of that next week when we talk about the 60s. We'll look more at what Martin Luther King was doing because he had his march and stuff like that in the 60s. But keep in mind that it started here in the 50s. This is also a racial situation that took place. This is a little girl named Linda Brown. And her parents wanted to send her to a nearby school, but it was a white school. And so she had to, take a circuitous route to get to her African-American school. And so they brought that case, also like a test case, to the Supreme Court. And let's see what happened.
Mr. Beat presents Supreme Court Briefs. Topeka, Kansas, 1950. Schools were segregated by skin color. Each day, 8-year-old Linda Brown and her sister had to walk 1 mile, crossing several busy railroad tracks along the way, to get to a bus that led them to a school across town. Now, an elementary school already existed just 4 blocks from their home, but this school was for white children only, and Linda Brown and her sister were African American. Linda's father, Oliver Brown, tried to enroll her in the white-only elementary school, but the principal of the school wouldn't allow it. So Brown went to the Topeka's branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, and asked for help. The NAACP had actually already been planning on challenging segregation in public schools. The organization helped 12 other African American parents attempt to enroll their children in whites-only schools in the Topeka School District. A major goal of the NAACP was to bring down the precedent set up by Plessy v. Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court decision that said segregated facilities based on skin color was okay as long as both facilities were the same quality. This became known as the, quote, separate but equal doctrine. The NAACP helped Brown and the rest of the parents sue the Board of Education of the city of Topeka after the district continued to refuse to let their children enroll in whites-only schools. The parents claimed their children's rights, as protected by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, were being violated. The NAACP put Oliver Brown at the head of the roster as a legal strategy. The Board of Education argued that segregation was already a way of life, and segregated schools simply got them ready for the segregation they would later encounter as adults. They also claimed that segregated schools were not harmful to black children. The United States District Court for the District of Kansas heard the case and ruled in favor of the Board of Education, using the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson as their justification. And yet, the three-judge district court panel argued that segregation hurt African American children. Still, they insisted that whites-only and blacks-only schools in Topeka were of equal quality in terms of facilities, the qualifications of teachers, transportation, and what they were taught. Brown and the rest of the parents appealed to the Supreme Court. As it turns out, there were parents across the entire country fighting fiercely against school segregation in public schools as well. In 1952, the court considered 5 different cases that all dealt with the issue. Ultimately, the court just combined all 5 cases under the name of Brown v. Board of Education. The NAACP had been involved in all 5 cases and appointed Thurgood Marshall, a future Supreme Court justice, to argue the case for Brown. The court heard the case in the spring of 1953, but remained divided on the issue, and they knew this was a big freaking deal, so they didn't want to rush it. Chief Justice Fred Vinson was really worried about a close vote that would dramatically change the country, and he, in particular, wanted to postpone the decision. Well, he died in September, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower nominated Earl Warren, the former governor of California, as Vinson's replacement. The court reheard the case in December 1953, with Warren now leading. For several months, the justices debated and discussed the case. One justice who had thought about voting against Brown, Robert H. Jackson, suffered a mild heart attack during this time. Warren went to visit him in the hospital, continuing to discuss the case during his recovery. Ultimately, Jackson would change his mind. Warren was able to do what Vinson was not. He brought all the justices together for a unanimous decision. That's right. On May 17, 1954, the court voted 9-0 in support of Brown. This overturned the now infamous Plessy v. Ferguson decision, saying that segregation of schools based on skin color went against the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court also argued that segregated schools made African American children feel inferior and damaged their development. Warren gave the opinion of the court, saying, quote, "We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal," unquote. Reporters at the announcement of the decision were shocked that it was unanimous. They expected a divided court. They were also shocked to see Robert Jackson there. Jackson had actually left the hospital directly to go there. He wanted to be there to show the court was truly united behind the decision. Now, the court did not announce how their ruling was to be enforced. Instead, it asked the attorney generals of all states enforcing segregation laws for their feedback. The court heard a bunch of more hearings over the next year, and on May 31st, 1955, announced a plan for how to proceed with the desegregation of public schools. They said it should occur with, quote, "all deliberate speed," whatever that means. That decision became known as Brown 2. Sounds like a great movie sequel. Anyway, of course, many tried to ignore the ruling, and it would take several years before school systems fully desegregated. The South, in particular, resisted. In probably the most famous case, 9 African American students attempted to go to the all-white Little Rock Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor, Orville Faubus, had prevented them from going. The Little Rock Nine, as they became known, were only allowed to attend after President Eisenhower stepped in and sent paratroopers to escort the students every day for an entire year. Other than Marbury v. Madison, Brown v. Board of Education might just be the most important Supreme Court decision in American history. It was consequential. All of a sudden, all of American society and even culture changed. It paved the way for integration and was a huge victory in the civil rights movement. It also proved as a model for using lawsuits to reform society.
All right. This is the Little Rock Nine right here. So 9 students who were attempting to go to the Little Rock High School. And when they started, they were essentially, given permission by Brown v. Education. But when they went, they were not allowed in. In fact, the police from Little Rock escorted them out of the school. So they got there to the school. The other students, actually the parents, were hurling insults at them. It's just awful. And they saw the police and they said, oh, good, the police are here to help us. But actually the police were there to escort them away. So it was really after the 3rd or 4th attempt to try to get into classes that President Eisenhower sent the National Guard. And for the rest of the year, they escorted them to classes. Unbelievable. But they did. Here they are. Here's one of them making her defiant walk into the school. And these people, just look at them just yelling at her. It just makes it makes my heart hurt back there. And I think these are the cops that were not helping. I'm pretty sure that's what that is. I'm not exactly sure. But look at her defiantly walking up. She wanted to go get her education that she had a right to. All right, 1959, we have Alaska becoming a state. Okay, it's our 49th state. Remember, it was purchased way back in the 1860s by Seward, right? Seward's Folly. And some people wondered if it was worth it. Why do we have this? But now it turns out that Alaska, of course, has proven to be very rich in natural resources and things like this. So it turns out that it's huge. All right, if we were to superimpose it over the rest of the United States, look how big it is. Oftentimes, we don't ever think of how large it is. Remember, Texas used to be the largest state. It still is the largest state of the continental, or the, how do you say that? Anyway, Alaska is the largest state now. It surpassed Texas, because look how huge it is. There are parts of Alaska, of course, up here that are somewhat uninhabitable because of cold. But then down in the south, right here, the most of the people live down in this area right here. I would like to go someday to Alaska. Mostly I'd like to see the Northern Lights. Apparently you can see them from there. In 1959, Hawaii also became a state. It's state number 50. Okay, so it's the last one to have become a state. Here they are holding up 50th state right there. Remember, there was a little bit of a, kind of a tough background there as far as what happened with Hawaii, how we essentially, took it from Queen Liliuokalani. Remember, in Oahu is where the capital city of Honolulu is. Remember, that's also where Pearl Harbor is. So we've seen this before, and the attacks that took place. The big island right here, most people call it the Big Island. It is the name. The name of the island is Hawaii. And then we have the Garden one, the Valley Isle of Maui. Molokai, which was a leper colony for the longest time. Now I believe you can go there. Lanai, Oahu, and Kauai over here. Those are the main ones. The biggest tourism area would be Oahu, and next comes Maui. I've been to both Oahu and Maui. I would like to go to the Big Island. I hear it's absolutely gorgeous out there. So now we have the complete the United States. Oftentimes when they show the map of the whole United States, it looks something like this. All right, so Alaska's been put down here. We know Alaska's not there, right? It's way up here, and Hawaii is way out there. And sometimes students will see a map like this and not realize where those are. They think they're just kind of down there somewhere. And also, it doesn't give really the idea of how large Alaska is. So starting in 1959, we have the whole United States here, the 50 states. Now we had the nuclear arms race going on between America and the communist nation, basically of the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, or Russia. And there's also a space race going on between these two same countries, between us and the Russians. And the idea is to have the greatest technology for reaching new heights, having new vistas of discovery. And we've kind of discovered everything on the Earth, although honestly we haven't at this point discovered everything under the sea, right? Or even in some of the interior portions of, I don't know, the thick Amazon jungle, stuff like this. But the idea here was using technology. There was all this new technology that had been developed, and there's going to be so much more. We have so much to be thankful for with the space race. Our computers, our modern day computers, those are all part of the technology that was discovered in order to have this race, the space race, getting first to somewhere, and namely at this point to the moon. So, in 1958, the Russians were the first ones to have a huge success, and that was when they launched a satellite into space, and it went into orbit around space. It's called Sputnik. This is a picture of it. It was basically a silver ball that was making a beeping sound. And so when it ran around, it would just beep, beep, and we could keep, the Russians could keep track of where it was. It did stay in orbit. But it wasn't really doing anything, just emitting this little beeping sound. It stayed up in orbit for about 90 days or so, and then it came crashing down. So this made the people in America think, oh my goodness, we're losing the space race. How did we let the Soviets, beat us in this kind of thing? And so Eisenhower created the National Space and Aeronautics Agency, so the NSAA, and that will morph into something you've heard of called NASA. All right, which is this, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, so established in 1958. NASA, the goal here was to explore space in a non-military way. All right, so this would be what they would call, quote unquote, a civilian organization. It doesn't mean that it's privately owned. It is owned by the government, but it was not for military purposes. We were not going into space in order to develop military weapons. That would change somewhat, but for this time, that was the official word. We started with a project called Project Mercury, where we started looking for special men who would go out and fly into space. The first one of the projects was Mercury. This sign over here is the insignia. The 7 is the number of men who were part of this, and this rest of this is the Greek sign or whatever for Mercury, the god Mercury, who was very, fast and fleet of foot, that kind of thing. You can see over here the little module that would put our guy up into orbit. So the goal of the Mercury project was to get our guy up out into space, right? So just going out of the Earth's atmosphere up into space and coming back down. That's all that was. And then eventually going into orbit around the Earth. And this will take place. Let's watch this. It's kind of a fun little video that shows what was going on at the beginning here. So we'll see that it actually, 1961 was when we actually got somebody into space, but it started in the 50s.
This is a press conference. April 9th, 1959, Washington, D.C. One of these 7 young men will be the first American into space. These are the astronauts. United States Project Mercury. substantial part of the imagination, energy, and genius of the United States is being devoted to the scientific exploration of our universe. The launching pads and gantries of the Atlantic Missile Range mount many of our experiments into the very nature of creation. This launch carried an Earth satellite into orbit. Soon, before the Earth turns many hundred times, a man will climb into a capsule at the Atlantic Missile Range and be hurled headlong into space. Why? Why must man go into space? Why must he attempt this new and forbidding environment? Space with its belts of radiation, meteorites, solar winds, unknown cosmic forces. To explore his world, man has always risked the unknown. Because it is unknown, and man's nature is to know. Project Mercury is a beginning for man in space. It will take him 100 miles from the Earth. Here, we think there are no radiation belts, solar winds, or unknown cosmic forces, but man, the scientist, the explorer, must see for himself. Each component of Project Mercury will be held up and measured in the unbending light of scientific truth. Will it work? Why? Does it work under load? Why not? The problem of selecting pilots to represent the United States in space was approached from the same uncompromising direction. From all of the active duty pilots in the Navy, Marines, and Air Force, the service records of 473 test pilots were selected for review. 110 met the basic qualifications. Each must be a graduate of a Navy or Air Force test pilot school, 1,500 hours of flight time, qualified in jet aircraft, an engineering background, younger than 40 at the time of selection, and 5 feet 11 or less. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration asked 69 Navy, Marine, and Air Force officers of the 110 who qualified to come to Washington for a briefing. They were interviewed, tested, and asked to volunteer for the Project Mercury mission. 6 were discovered to be too tall. 16 declined. And 47 volunteered. 32 were asked to continue through a series of capability tests which would indicate not the best man in the group, but the various degrees of qualification of each man. Two candidates reported to the Lovelace Clinic in Albuquerque, New Mexico for an exhaustive series of physical examinations. These tests were divided between those given under normal clinical procedures and a series used for the first time in Project Mercury. A series of dynamic tests designed to measure the candidates' abilities during physical stress. Laboratory studies were made in each physiological area. As military pilots, these men had passed yearly flight physicals. But here at the Lovelace Clinic, each measurable reaction of body chemistry, each physical function was measured, probed, diagnosed. What is the specific gravity of his body? What is his blood volume, water volume? What is his total body radiation count? We are listening to his heart. When the astronaut is orbiting in space, the measure of his heart's contraction and expansion will be telemetered to the Mercury tracking stations. After a week of examinations, the candidates were sent on to the Wright Air Development Center in Dayton for stress evaluation and psychological tests. This Project Mercury candidate is preparing for stress. The weight of 8 gravities will thrust upon him as he rides the human centrifuge. His reactions are studied. The results will indicate how he fared under multiple gravity forces. Did he show a tendency to pull back? No. Was his tolerance level low or was it high? Now, can we shake his equilibrium? How does this affect his pulse and blood pressure? And what about his mental balance, his imagination, his personality, motivation? How does he see the different problems of living? And how has life affected him as an individual? Test his memory, comprehension, perception, visualization. Ask him to describe himself in 100 different ways with a battery of tests. Now take him up to 65,000 feet for 1 hour in a pressure chamber. Now have him do this for 5 minutes. Then ask him to take a walk. Walk until his heart beats 180 times a minute. Elevate the incline 1 degree every minute. These tests continued until all 32 men had been evaluated.
Okay, so that was just the introduction to what these guys that we're now calling astronauts were going to be tested for. Okay, so they were looking for the guys that had the right stuff. And they ended up with these 7 guys right here. In fact, they made a movie about these guys called The Right Stuff. It's very good. I think it might be rated R, so I'm not sure if your folks will let you watch it. But if you do, let me know. So we're looking at the 7 guys right here who would go on to become, pretty famous. They became kind of the rock stars of their age. Back here we have Alan Shepard. He almost looks too tall, right? I was really surprised at that height, requirement there. So Alan Shepard, this guy is Gus Grissom, and Gordo Cooper, right back here. This guy is Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, who you may have heard of, and Scott Carpenter right here. So these are the 7 guys of the Mercury program. So the idea was that the what they wanted to do, a couple of goals. One was to get a guy up in space, and one of these guys would do it. They did not know who was going to get to go up and do that. And then they would have the first guy who would go into orbit around the Earth. They also did not know who was going to do that, but they were all trained for the same thing, and they would eventually go and become part of other space programs, okay, that were become quite famous. All right, so it turns out that here's the guy. It was Alan Shepard who got to be the first guy in space. Now, this technically happened in 1961, but the program started in 59, so it started in the 50s, so I wanted to cover it here. So next week when we're talking about the 60s, we'll talk more about the space program, but it all is part of the space race, which of course was heating up here in the 1950s. So there he is. That's a trivia question for you. First man in space, first American in space is Alan Shepard. He sadly is not the first man in space because the Russians beat us on that one as well. We had spying going on, and this was a pretty infamous case right here. Gary Powers was a pilot, and he was flying a brand new, very fancy airplane high above Russia and taking pictures, so that would make him a spy. And we're going to watch a little video about what took place with Gary Powers. He was shot down, and here is the wreckage of his spy plane. Let's see what happened.
U-2 incident. The Cold War, May 1st, 1960. In the 1950s, as tensions increased between the USA and the USSR, Khrushchev agreed to a summit meeting in Paris between the USSR, USA, Britain, and France in 1960. Hopes were high for a peaceful coexistence. It was hoped that the USSR and the USA would discuss the increasing tensions in Berlin and discuss the possibility of a nuclear test ban treaty. These hopes were shattered on May 1st, 1960, just 13 days before the summit, when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the USSR and its pilot, Gary Powers, captured. The U-2 was a sophisticated spy plane developed by the Americans, capable of top-secret reconnaissance because it could fly at very high altitudes of more than 13 miles above the ground, making it unreachable by Soviet jets and anti-aircraft missiles. They were, however, visible on Soviet radar. President Eisenhower had used the U-2 planes to gather intelligence on the Soviet nuclear missile capabilities, and over 4 years of unengaged spying discovered that the USA was ahead in this area. This time, the Soviets had a new surface-to-air missile that could reach the ranges of the U-2 spy plane. CIA pilot Gary Powers took off from a U.S. airbase in Pakistan towards the USSR, taking photos of military sites when the missiles locked on to his spy plane. The missile exploded near the plane, causing it to drop altitude. As another missile made a direct hit, Powers ejected over Soviet territory and was captured by Soviet forces. On May 5th, Khrushchev announced the downed American spy plane, but Eisenhower denied the plane's real mission, claiming it was a weather plane as a cover story. However, the Soviets had managed to recover the photos Powers had taken and wreckage evidence, proving that the aircraft was indeed for surveillance purposes. Khrushchev demanded an apology when Eisenhower had been caught lying. Khrushchev also wanted an end to unauthorized flights by U.S. aircraft over Soviet territory. Eisenhower refused to apologize. Now relations between the USA and USSR were again at a low. At the beginning of the talks on May 16th, Khrushchev walked out of the summit meeting hours before it started, withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the USSR, and abandoned talks for nuclear disarmament. Furthermore, as there were no talks on the problems in Berlin, the U-2 incident would lead to the Berlin Wall's construction. Gary Powers, meanwhile, was put on trial and sentenced to 10 years in prison in the Soviet Union. However, he was released in early 1962 when an exchange for a Soviet spy called Rudolf Abel took place between America and the Soviet Union.
Okay. So, like it said in the video, Rudolf Abel was exchanged. He was a guy who had been arrested here in America for spying. This was made into a movie fairly recently with Tom Hanks called Bridge of Spies. And so we were able to get Gary Powers back, but only after making that exchange. And this, once again, is taking place in the late 50s, early 60s right now. There's Abel right there. At this period of time, we have the career of this young man coming to the forefront. His name is Billy Graham. You've probably all heard of him. In fact, he just passed away, I think, a year ago or so. So he lived a nice, long life. He was an evangelist. You'll be reading about him in your book. And you'll find out that he had an incredibly influential career. Remember the guy we talked about last time from the, what was his name? The guy from the... from Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss, remember him? That later in his life he actually came to a Billy Graham crusade and got saved there. That has been made into a movie as well. I can't remember what it's called, but it has it's like the sequel to the Hacksaw Ridge movie. So Billy Graham, he went around the country giving these great revival talks, and there was a bit of a revival. He was a good, wholesome guy, right, talking about Jesus. Good stuff. At this time also we had a group of guys who were down in a foreign land. These 5 guys and their families were actually down in South America and had started a mission down there, and they had an outreach to a group of natives who had been completely unreached, isolated in the forests down there. And you might recognize the name of Jim Elliot. These other guys were there with him. They had a plane that they would go visit with these group, and eventually what happened was this group, these natives, became very suspicious of these guys and were not happy about it. They ended up actually killing these 5 guys. So these guys died for the faith. They also got made into a movie called is it The Tip of the Spear or something like that? Very good movie about Elliot there. You'll be reading in your text, I believe, about this family. This is the Kennedy family. We know about John right here because we know about his story in World War II when he saved his entire his entire PT boat squadron with, saving those guys from being attacked. But this would be, some people would say this is the closest to American royalty. We don't have royalty in America, but they were certainly a dynasty. So we have Joseph P. Kennedy right here and his wife Rose, and then their children. I'm not sure if I can name them all. This is their firstborn son. His name is Joe Jr., and then their firstborn daughter Rosemary. And of course we have John, and little Teddy is right here. So his name is Edward. This is Robert Kennedy. This is Catherine, named Kick. I don't know if I know the rest of the girls' names. Okay, Edith, I think, is one of them. Maybe Ethel, something like that. Anyhow, this family has been an American kind of iconic family. Sadly, they've suffered an immense amount of tragedy, which we will cover as we go through our history right here. But in the 50s, it was an idyllic look right here. Of course, in the 40s, Joe was actually killed in the war, and Kick also died during the war. She was on a plane with somebody else, and I don't think it got shot down, but I think it just went down. And so by the time of the 50s came around, it was already, Rose and Joe were already suffering some losses right there. And furthermore, their daughter, Rosemary right here, who had some mental instabilities, her father had taken her to get the latest treatment called a frontal lobotomy, and it ended up turning her into a vegetable. Yeah, so that was very sad. McDonald's was invented in the 1950s. We've all been there, right? And so the idea was that they would have a burger that would be inexpensive and fast, made quickly, and available for the people. It was invented by 2 brothers who were called the McDonald brothers, but it was quickly bought out by somebody else named Ray Kroc, and I think this is Ray Kroc, who turned it into a franchise, which he would have several stores in different areas owned by different people, but he got a cut of all that. So it was quite innovative on his part right there to turn this into the powerhouse that it is still today. All right, we're looking at art and music and pop cultures of the 1950s. Let's check this out. This guy is called Mark Rothko. He had come over, I believe, from Russia, and he started kind of in the postmodern movement, the expressionist movement, something called the color block. When he was younger, his color block paintings looked somewhat like this, very colorful, very bright colors. This one's kind of cool. You might be thinking, I could paint that. Yeah, probably a good argument right there. As he got older, things became darker. So he had darker colors like this, and to the point where at the end of his life, mostly his canvases were, seriously, just like all black. Yeah, so kind of became dark. It kind of reflected his mood a little bit, too. He was sort of a depressed kind of a guy. Here's the black, and near the end of his life. Jasper Johns, he's one of my favorite guys. I just like his fun paintings he has, like this target over here. It looks like something you could hang on the wall, right? It's kind of a fun-looking painting. He's most famous for his flag series, like this one here. I find that patriotic. I like it a lot. I think it's really good. That's John's. Andrew Wyeth was part of a group. His family was sort of a group of artists. And his most famous painting is right here, called Christina's World. His father had been a famous artist, and I think he had a couple of brothers that ended up being famous artists as well. But this is called Christina's World, and it shows her, out in the field right here. It turns out, I guess she couldn't walk, and she was sort of pulling herself through the field, which kind of takes away from it for me. But he was an influential artist at the time. For sports, we're looking here at Jackie Robinson. You've probably heard of him. He was one of the first guys to break through the black barrier for the national leagues and came up and played in the national leagues. He was number 42, so you might, there was a movie made about him called, I believe the movie was called 42. In the 1950s, most of the families ended up with TVs, sort of like we saw the people in the 30s with their radios, right? And in the 40s, they still listened to radio. But now they're all watching TVs. So this is going to change things quite a bit. The movies will change somewhat. They'll have to become bigger and splashier and this kind of thing to beat out this screen that the people had at home. Notice it's a pretty small screen. It's, of course, black and white. And so they'd all be kind of crowded around it like that. It would take a little while for it to catch up to the kind of things that we have today, big color ones. Here's one of the TV shows they were watching. This is Lucille Ball. She had been a starlet in Hollywood in some comedies and musicals. She was actually a dancer, very good at it. But she had this show she started called I Love Lucy, which to this day still holds up. It's still a great TV show. Here's a scene, one of the most famous scenes with her and her friend Ethel trying to package up candy, and they can't move quickly enough, so they're like stuffing them in their shirt and eating them and stuff like that. Very funny. I still find it funny today. Rock and roll became very big. So music became quite important in the 1950s. We're looking here at one of the most influential, but often not really given credit for kind of the beginning of rock and roll. This guy's name is Little Richard. It's possible he's still around. He may have, recently died, but I know he became a Christian preacher later in his life, but he was really a talented musician, and furthermore, put on a really good show. And he brought about this, it's kind of coming out of the jazz movement, bringing in that backbeat and stuff like this, and turning into this really good rock and roll. Chuck Berry, also not as credited as some of the other people out there, but he played guitar like you never heard. It's really amazing. And here he is doing his famous dance on the stage right here. You can look up some of these guys if you want to and check out some of their music. Jerry Lee Lewis was from down south. Rock and roll meets country. He was an impresario, basically, on the piano. He did Great Balls of Fire and stuff like this. Kind of a bad boy personality. He would get up and, stomp on his piano and stuff. Patsy Cline, speaking of country music, she had an incredible voice. And she just really brought out the fans as far for her singing. Tragically, she was killed in a plane crash at the height of her career. Johnny Cash lived for a long time. You've probably heard of him. He eventually married his sweetheart. Here she is, June Carter, who became June Carter Cash. And the two of them made some pretty excellent, kind of almost a crossover between country and rock as well on these two. Buddy Holly was from Texas. He was from Lubbock. And oh my goodness, he had some of the most fun rock and roll music out there. You would recognize some of his stuff, Peggy Sue and things like this. Sadly, he was also killed in a plane crash. In fact, they call it the day the music died, when he and a couple other guys were going from one place to another, one concert to another, and it was cold outside, and their plane, they think it got iced over or something, and it went down in a field, and they were all killed. And one of the other guys was the Big Bopper, and the third guy was Richie Valens, who was a young and up-and-coming star who had a couple of hits, La Bamba being one of those. And, of course, the king. This is Elvis. Elvis would have been the kind of the iconic 50s singer at this point. He had been raised in the South, had sort of that upbringing with the African American influence on his music, and he applied that. I think I have, a song for us to take a listen to. You probably will recognize it.
Hey, pick up on
Okay, so there we go. Sorry about the poor quality there. That was one of his big hits. Now, the parents were all very concerned about what was going on here because he was making movements with his body that were way too crazy. And so he was on the cutting edge there that some of those 50s parents were thinking, oh no, you can't be watching this guy. We'll see that this will translate later into the 60s to other groups that parents were concerned were, influencing their children badly. All right, it looks like that's it, y'all. We have a shorter lecture today. Hooray. So just keep up trying to get your homework done. I think the best way to get it to me is through taking a picture of it and trying to send it, through email. So, all right, I'll be in contact soon. Y'all have a great week. Bye.